Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful day. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here in Chile. Been having a wonderful time. And today I want to take about 30 minutes here right before lunch to talk about urban design, public life, and how that could make our urban future hopefully more livable, competitive, and inclusive. So I'm an architect and urban designer living in Denmark, but the American accent's kind of hard to lose, right? So obviously American, but been living and working in Copenhagen for 15 years. The topic here was supposed to be a bit about smart cities and the future, and I had the pleasure of having dinner with the president of Chile 2 days ago. And by having dinner, I mean 150 other people were there too, and I didn't talk to her or anything. But she had a very nice speech where she said that she hopes that the urban future, not just the urban future, our future, is actually much more human. And I thought that was beautiful, to be thinking about technology and progress and so many exciting things that are happening, but at the end of the day, making sure that we're thinking about people and humans. Because if there's one thing we know about the future, is that our physiology is going to be basically the same. In 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, the foreseeable future, our senses are going to work the same way. We're going to appreciate handshakes and hugs in the same way that we did thousands of years ago. And we will continue along that path of being a human being. But our surroundings, just in the way that they've changed already in the last 100 years, especially in cities, our surroundings will change quite dramatically, as will our urban culture. That's going to change quite quickly. So the man who lends his name to our company, Jan Gehl, the philosophical base for our practice, this is a picture of him. He's about 80 years old now. He's going to turn 80 this year. So he's been studying this for 55 years. And when he first graduated architecture school in Denmark, it was all about beautiful design, aesthetics, incredibly well-designed objects and things. And so when his architect friends would come over and they'd have these dinners, anyone that was not outside of the architecture field wondered why architects were talking so much about things and not about people. Jan's girlfriend at the time was totally befuddled by this. How could architects work to create housing like this here, typical housing in the 60s, you see a lot of it all over the world, build these things but not really care or understand or have any knowledge about people? So he went on to marry that woman. This is a picture. She was a developmental psychologist and greatly influenced his approach to be less about form and design. Yes, that's important, but also about being a human, our behavior, our choices, our senses. So with that influence from his wife, he shifted direction completely, went much more into sociology, and wrote this book back in 1971, and has continued to publish and write and be a real global leader around public life and around human beings in cities. Thinking about the topic of this presentation, about smart cities, about technology, I'm actually not going to say a whole lot about technology, but I'll start out, just if you came for that, then you get something for your time. But it's incredibly important to understand what we want to do first, to know what the vision is, to have an idea of where we're headed, and then think about technology as a tool for that, rather than our fascination with technology driving the agenda. So just because we can do something doesn't mean that we necessarily should. And it's a big part of technology, of course, is data. It's an incredible statistic that actually the amount of data we generate globally doubles about every 40 months. And this is speeding up. So we are essentially drowning in data. We have more information than we have any idea about what to do with. And so the key is to be very specific with how we want to use that information for specific questions, right? So just as an example of that, in our work, we're using some social media, Instagram. How many of you all use Instagram? I noticed some young and old people raising their hands. Instagram is interesting because it's supposedly the social media that is used most broadly across ages, genders, and social income, socioeconomic status. So we have plugged into some open data from Instagram and have tested some things that we think are interesting. So looking at 2 public spaces in San Francisco, what we can find out is we look at all the photos that were taken in that public space and then match that photo with an individual person and find out where they've taken a lot of their photos. And then we can pretty accurately find out where that person lives. So that's kind of scary or kind of interesting. I don't know. But we can find that information. We don't know exactly where you live, not like your address or anything. But we know where you take lots of other photos, and we know information about most importantly, about the social, economic composition of that neighborhood. And so for us, equity and inclusion is incredibly important in the public realm. And so we can find out not only where people came from to spend time in these public spaces, but also what is the average household income, what is unemployment, what is household size, what is the demographic composition of where that person lives. And this is interesting for us because we want to find out how we invite people from all backgrounds to actually use the public realm, to be able to feel invited and welcome to use cities. And data, this Instagram tool, can help us hopefully make better decisions about how we design those places, how we invite. Now, we know that Instagram users is still a small slice of the population, and that's why for the rest of my presentation, we're going to talk about good old-fashioned humanism and less about technology, right? Because it's incredibly important that we understand that not just because we can count it doesn't mean that it counts. So this brilliant Einstein quote about not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts actually can be counted. So the focus of this idea of creating friendlier cities is really broken up into 3 parts. It's very much about establishing a common vision, measuring, getting shared experiences. We'll talk more about that. Understanding that change is constant. We have to test ideas. We have to be willing to fail a little bit. We have to iterate, and we have to learn by doing as much as we can. And hopefully we can empower doers at all levels. So whether you be a mayor or an elected official or a bureaucrat or an average everyday citizen, we want to find out how we can leverage that talent and energy and use it much more efficiently. And so this is connected to this process of, if we understand that our cities are changing quite rapidly, we need to measure what we care about and test and refine over time and iterate through that process. So this first idea about measuring what we care about. So when Yan started to think about people, he found out that there was very little data about people, actually. Traffic engineers always knew exactly how many cars were in a city at any given moment, always knew traffic volumes all over the city. But there wasn't any knowledge, not any information about people moving through a city and how that was affecting their behavior. So he developed a methodology that these folks here are taking part in. So the man and the woman on the left, they are measuring, they're observing what the 2 women are doing. And so these 2 women are being counted, or they are engaging in the city-making process just by going about their everyday routine. So this ethnographic approach of going out, meeting citizens where they are, observing their behavior, documenting it systematically throughout the course of the day, week, and year, formulates the basis for design decisions. It also does something else. It contributes to this common vision and understanding. So when we ask politicians or city officials or students or folks that are dealing with the city to go out, like these folks are, stand on a street corner and watch public life. And not just watch it, but document it. It's an incredibly eye-opening experience. You'd be surprised how few city leaders have ever done that, how few people in general have ever done that. But it's incredibly powerful to find out what works and what doesn't. Who is struggling to walk along the street? Are there a lot of kids? Are the elderly crossing safe? Are there rich and poor people in the same places or not? So this methodology used worldwide, and we've collected a whole lot of data, a big database, essentially, of quantitative and qualitative information. So we also observe and understand, well, what conditions of the built environment is this public life taking place? Because there's a relationship between the form of the city and the life that's within it. And this is basically the basis of the transformation that many cities have undertaken over the past 10 or 15 years, Copenhagen being one of the first, where Jan started his work, being able to transform many parts of the city, from car parking lots to new harborfront developments, all sort of very bold decisions that city leaders in Copenhagen could do with the help of this data and information. So this quote is wonderful. Without this public life understanding, we wouldn't have had the courage to implement many projects. So this is about giving leaders courage and wisdom to make better, bold decisions that will end up being in the best interests of their constituents, of their citizens. But it's clear if you don't have that information, it's very difficult to make decisions about public life if you don't know anything about it. So Copenhagen is definitely a world leader in this standpoint, one of the most livable cities in the world. It keeps me there, despite being incredibly dark and cold. There's another thing about shared experiences, a quick story. So we were working in Denver, Colorado, and this interesting street there, one of the most important streets in the city, has a few thousand pedestrians every day, but has a ton of buses, free buses every 1.5 minutes running up and down this street. So much so that you don't really get a chance to be on the street without thinking that a bus is going to run over you. The mayor knew that this street, while was fantastic in terms of moving people from A to B, was underperforming in terms of life, in terms of economic growth, in terms of inclusivity. We went out to people in the city and actually found out more about how things were working. We measured them, got some of this data about how many people pass through and how many people spend time. But we also did something interesting where we asked citizens what they're expert in. We asked them about their favorite places in the city and asked them to map it and tell us why they like those favorite places. And this type of form of engagement is much, much different than maybe you've experienced. First off, we go to them, so you don't have to go to the meeting after work, in the school, after you're tired and you need to take care of your kids. The engagement comes to you, and you can participate not only by going about your everyday business, but also by telling us things that you know a lot about. What's your favorite place in the city? Everyone could answer that question. So with this information, we made a suggestion for how the buses could maybe be rerouted, keeping accessibility, but allowing for a new pedestrian core to really pop up in the center of town. The leader of the bus operations, of course, the whole bus company was very much against this. Understandably, it was change. It was going to make their life different. And this man here was quoted in the local newspaper, "We don't feel it's appropriate to experiment with our customers. We don't want to change things. Everything's working fine. We don't want to change things." But what we actually did is we had tested some projects. We tried a few things out. We took the buses away just for a few Sundays and then went out and took pictures and saw what could happen. And these are not just Photoshop files, but this is like the street when the buses are on it and the street afterwards. Incredible change. And we took this guy with us, different city leaders, public and private sector, out there to experience this together. Because you'll be, again, surprised how oftentimes city leaders make decisions without ever actually experiencing things together. So we were fighting with this bus operator. We had one vision, he had another. We took him out there. We talked about what worked, what didn't. We had a wonderful shared experience. And at the end of it, he bought us a beer and said, "You know what? We should do this every single weekend in the summer. This is fantastic." Just because we had that shared experience, right? And he gave us lots of good input that we could use for our design, but now we were on the same team. We had a common vision. New York City, we've been working for many years. Started out the same methodology, going out, documenting what's there, what's working, what's not, and found some really shocking truth that no one had ever actually realized before. Like, for example, this is Times Square. This is the area between 42nd Street and 47th Street. And we found out that Times Square actually had no square. There was no square there. It was 90% road space. So citizens had told themselves, "Oh, we're going to Times Square," and it was just like a busy traffic. So we showed this to Mayor Bloomberg at the time, could show that there was no square there, and yet 90% of all the people in Times Square were on foot. 400,000 of the 500,000 people there every day were squeezed into this tiny little space. So if you're a politician, especially someone like Bloomberg who really likes data, this is a game changer, right? We have to do something about this because we know this is underperforming from a people's perspective. So, again, pilots, test projects. The first idea was to reclaim some of that space, give it over to people. It was only supposed to be for 6 weeks when it was first launched, but something incredible happened that almost instantaneously people took ownership of it, had a wonderful time out there, and became supporters and proponents. This space here in front of Macy's department store, before we did the pilot, Macy's was totally against it. You're going to kill our business. How will our customers get there? This can't work. You could try it for a week, but we know it's not going to work, and then you can get out of our way and leave us alone, right? After 2 days, they were telling us, we need more benches. We don't ever want this to go away. Can we put more umbrellas out there because it's a little hot? So they were, again, common vision, part of the whole process. The beauty of this case in New York is that these spaces were canvases. They were something that could be flexible and adjust, something that could be just a catalyst for creativity, entrepreneurship, energy of citizens to change as it went along. So the first furniture out here in another square, first was kind of boring city paid for stuff. Then the private sector came in, replaced it. They wanted more. And now spaces like this are also literally canvases for public art, public life, all sorts of different culture expression that didn't have an outlet in the city prior to this. So the key to these changes, everyone has to benefit. In 2015, we can't favor one group over the other. There has to be win-win-win-win-win solutions. So the beauty of some of these designs is that not only that we create more public space for people, but we also allow traffic to move more freely through the city. So that top diagram, that top picture, shows this very messy intersection. And by reclaiming public space, actually, people that want to drive now can move faster through downtown. And people that want to spend time have a public space to spend time in. So learning from this use, testing things out, we found out that the bicycle lane shown here, in between the existing sidewalk and the new reclaimed public space, didn't work very well. But because it was paint and temporary materials, we could learn from that use and then adjust it. Understanding that we could make mistakes and that we could engage people, have people vote with their feet and not just with their hands. This incredible transformation, 400,000 square feet, 40,000 square meters of space all throughout the city, proof to this that if you see the city with new eyes, you can find opportunity in many different locations. The interesting thing about this, too, is that this has been scaled up now. It's not only Times Square, it's not only Broadway, but many different plazas all throughout the city, 61 in all, have utilized some of the same very, very simple approach to create vast, very, very important, needed public space in areas that don't have much public space. So the brown dots here are neighborhoods that are underserved in open space, and the blue dots have integrated this very simple concept of removing some traffic lanes, putting in this furniture, and it's making a huge impact on community. We know that people are using these plazas. They're recognizing more folks. 53% of people recognize or know more people since these plazas opened. It's fostering social connections. We know that actually the poorer folks in these areas are more likely to make new connections out in these public space. But at the same time, richer people are also using the same area. So if you think about how many places in Santiago are true locations where rich and poor and in between and students and professionals meet and interact, hopefully there's a few examples, but that is what the public realm is all about. It's for everyone. It's the great neutralizer. Everyone should feel welcome, and we're learning through this process about how to make these spaces even more inviting and welcoming for everyone. Increased sense of safety, more people saying that they feel safe in the neighborhood now that they know more people, and now there is a public space that keeps eyes on the street throughout the course of the day. So the last section here is about empowering leaders at every level. Better Market Street project in San Francisco. This is the main street of San Francisco. We started working there back in 2011. Had a great design and found out essentially that design that we made in 2011 couldn't be implemented for another 5 or 6 years. And we know that urban cultures change very quickly. So what were we going to do in the interim? How can we engage all this frustration and interest and energy of folks into making their city better while we wait for the big investment to come? So we created something called the Market Street Prototyping Festival, partnered with foundations, arts organizations, the city, and devised a plan to give 50 projects $2,000 to build what they wanted. So citizens could go out, make a prototype of something that could engage and create more public life. It wasn't just what you wanted, right? We had to be very specific directions. Your prototype needs to invite for young and old, needs to build community, needs to provide places for people to meet and interact in fun ways. But all these brilliant concepts and ideas came up that we could never have thought of ourselves. And there was a platform now for citizens to be part of the yes in their city, not just using their energy to say no or to fight against change. There was an outlet for them to be part of the solution. They were empowered to take part in their city in an active, meaningful way. Now, what's great about all these different prototypes, some worked better than others, they sensed this untapped creative potential. Folks that made these prototypes weren't all architects or designers. They were computer programmers. They were everyday citizens. They were people that wanted fun stuff like this in the city. And they had a chance to make sure that it could be showcased for everyone else. Because what was great about this festival was that of the 15,000 folks that commented on it on social media, 3/4 of them knew nothing about what a prototype was or what this festival was. They were just going about their business on the street and had an interesting experience. So 12,000 people now have a new vision for what this street can be. And they've seen and talked to the people who invested blood, sweat, and tears into creating something tangible and meaningful for the city. So we took this information, we measured it, we found out what worked and what didn't, gave it to city staff, and now the city is financing a smaller scale version of this, financing 5 projects, 5 of the most successful projects to be implemented over the next year. Last story, Mar del Plata. Began working with the city government in Mar del Plata. They came to Copenhagen, got inspired, went back to their city, saw something that looked very different. They saw their city with some new eyes, saw conditions like this, which we recognize from Santiago and many other places in Chile. Used this approach, ethnography, observing what's happening out in cities, and we found that there was, again, this mismatch of how space was used versus how it was distributed. So on a really important street, 75% of all the movement there was actually squeezed in to 17% of the space. A lot of the area was given to cars, and a big chunk, a fifth of it, 20%, was actually just basically like this, unusable, completely impossible to use for anything meaningful. With this information, inspired by New York, city leaders there instigated some pilot projects. Let's try something out. Quick, affordable, had a lot of support, political interest behind it, created 40% more space for people. Young and old were using it. We moved 12 parking spaces and created 120 places to sit. Huge trade-off there. Lovers were using it. Yeah, it was great. Everyone was happy. 2 months into the process, the vice mayor calls us up and says, we have to take the project out. People are on social media. They're commenting. They're writing blogs about who's really winning from this. Who's gaining? What political deals are being made for the business owners along this street that have caused this project to happen, right? So they were complaining. They didn't trust the government. They didn't know why this was happening. The other thing people were complaining about is they didn't like the furniture. They thought it wasn't good enough. It looked too European or looked too cheap. It wasn't Argentinian furniture. So he tells me this on the phone. I'm like, okay, that's great that you have concrete information from your stakeholders. And he's like, what? That's horrible. We have to take him out. But this type of dialogue is exactly what pilot projects should be doing. They should be closing the gap between citizen and decision maker, allowing citizens an outlet to make meaningful input and for leaders to hear it. He said, okay, if you say so, we'll keep it out there. What do we do? He said, well, let's try to get some concrete information to battle the loud noise on social media. So let's go out and measure and compare to what it was like before. Let's find out how things are working. So we found there was 15% more pedestrians there. More than half of it was actually seating, which is great for shop owners. We found that actually when we asked folks out in the street, a majority of them thought the intervention were good. So the loudest people, it was just a few folks, were making a big issue about this, but a majority of the people that were there every day thought it was fine. But we still had a responsibility to those people that gave us feedback, right? So here, city officials went out on the street, stood next to furniture, got feedback from people, held workshops where people could say what works and what doesn't, what seems like good Argentinian design and what seems too European. They took that information on board and then changed the design. So now there was trust between citizens and decision makers. They spoke, decision makers listened, and they actually held a vote and said, okay, if we make these changes that you guys wanted, will you support this project? 90% of all the people that voted said yes, and now they had the political backing to keep this going, and the project was all the better for it because meaningful input, things that people are expert in, became really helpful advice to the designers and the other folks that were implementing this work. So all these examples hopefully give some momentum to a public life movement where we care in cities as much about form and design and objects and things. We still need to care about those. We need engineers and architects working with our cities. We also need law, regulation, policy, and zoning, but we need more effort, more focus, more money, input, and energy spent on all the stuff that happens between buildings, on all public life, on culture, to help balance this out a little bit, to bring more voices to the table, and to put an effort into the things that matter most, which is the culture of our city. So hopefully, it's not just about talking, right? It's about investing. It's about platforms for energy and time and effort to focus on people and find out what is best for them. And that's a process. Measure, test, refine. That's about these steps that I laid out. It's about a whole lot more, but at least these three things about a common vision, about iterative change, and about empowering people at every level. So I thank you for your time and your interest, and appreciate it.